The invisible village. In the vast, windswept expanse of the Salisbury Plain, there is a place that shouldn't exist. If you look at a modern satellite map, you see the outlines of buildings, a church, and the unmistakable grid of a village. But if you try to drive there today, you won't find a welcoming sign or a cozy pub. Instead, you will be met by towering fences, red flags fluttering in the wind, and bold, yellow signs that scream a single word: danger. This is Imber, a village that has been frozen in time since December 1943. While the rest of the world moved on, rebuilt after the war, and entered the digital age, Imber remained trapped in a state of permanent evacuation. It is a ghost town not because of a plague or a natural disaster, but because of a broken promise. Why did an entire community vanish in just 47 days? What happened to the families who left their Christmas decorations hanging, believing they would return in a few months? Today, on Britain's forgotten streets, we are embarking on our longest investigation yet. We are uncovering the heart-wrenching story of the town that Britain sacrificed for war, and then simply forgot to give back. Life before the silence. To understand the pain of the exile, we must first understand what was lost. Before 1943, Imber was a picture-perfect English village. It was isolated, yes, tucked away in the chalk downlands, but it was far from empty. It was a place of deep roots. Families like the Jews, the Paces, and the Noys had lived here for generations. Imagine the sounds of that time. The clatter of horses on the flint-strewn streets. The ringing of the bells at St. Giles Church, which had stood there since the 13th century. There was a bustling blacksmith, a post office that served as the village gossip hub, and the Bell Inn, a pub where farmers would gather after a hard day's work in the fields to share a pint and talk about the harvest. Life in Imber was dictated by the seasons. It was a slow, traditional life. But as the 1930s drew to a close, a different kind of sound began to echo across the plains, the rumble of heavy machinery. The military had been buying up land around the village for years, using the open space for artillery practice. The villagers were used to the noise, but they never imagined that the military's appetite for land would eventually swallow their homes whole. The eviction, the 47-day countdown. The turning point came on a cold, grey morning in November 1943. World War II was at its peak. The Allied forces were secretly planning the invasion of Europe, D-Day. They needed a place to train soldiers in house-to-house combat, a skill that was vital for the liberation of occupied towns in France and Germany. The representative of the War Office arrived in Imber and called a meeting in the village schoolroom. The news was a hammer blow. Every man, woman, and child was ordered to leave. They were given exactly 47 days. The deadline was set for just before Christmas. Can you imagine the chaos of those weeks? Farmers had to sell off livestock they had raised for years. Grandmothers had to decide which heirlooms to pack and which to leave to the dust. But there was no riot. There was no protest. The people of Imber were patriots. They were told their village was needed to win the war. They were given a verbal promise by the military: go now, for the sake of the country, and when the war ends, you can come home. They believed it. On their last day, many villagers did something deeply moving. They greased the hinges of their front doors. They polished their brass knockers. They left their homes ready for their own return. One farmer famously left a note on his table: please look after our home. We will be back soon. The war on the streets. As the last truck pulled away, the silence of Imber was shattered. But it wasn't the sound of children playing, it was the sound of gunfire. The American 101st Airborne Division moved in. To them, Imber wasn't a village, it was a combat training zone. They practiced clearing rooms, throwing grenades into windows where lace curtains still hung, and driving tanks over garden walls. The village was brutalized. The Bell Inn was used as a sniper's nest. The thatch roofs, which had been meticulously maintained for centuries, caught fire and collapsed. By the time 1945 arrived and the bells of victory rang out across Europe, Imber was a shell of its former self. But the villagers were jubilant. The war was over. The promise was ready to be fulfilled. Except the gate stayed locked. The The Ministry of Defense looked at the Salisbury Plain and realized they didn't want to give it up. They had created the perfect permanent training ground. In 1946, the official word came down: Imber would remain a military zone. Forever. The villagers were told they were tenants, not owners, and their right to retain was legally non-existent. The promise was broken, and a new battle began, a battle between a small group of farmers and the might of the British state. The skeleton of a town. If you visit Imber during the few days a year it is open to the public, the first thing you notice is the uncanny valley of the architecture. Most of the original Victorian cottages are gone, destroyed by decades of training. In their place, the army built FIBUA houses, an acronym for fighting in built-up areas. These are grey, windowless concrete blocks that look like houses from a distance but are empty, cold shells inside. But in the center of it all, St. Giles Church still stands. It is the only building the military truly protected. Walking through the graveyard is a haunting experience. You see the names of the families who were kicked out, buried here because it was the only way they could ever return to their village. You see the rusted remains of the old water pump, once the social center of the town, now standing in a field of weeds. There is a specific smell in Imber, a mix of wet concrete, old stone, and gunpowder. It feels like a place that is mourning its own existence. There are no trees in the village center anymore. They were all cleared to provide better lines of sight for the soldiers. It is a street map with no residents, a town with no pulse. The price of silence. Imber is more than just a ghost town. It is a scar on the British landscape that reminds us of the true cost of war. It wasn't just lives lost on the battlefield. It was an entire way of life, a culture, and a community that was deleted for the greater good. The families of Imber fought in the courts for decades, but the law was never on their side. Today, the streets are empty, save for the occasional roar of a Challenger tank or the chatter of soldiers on a midnight drill. The forgotten streets of Imber are a warning that once a place is taken by the machine of war, it is rarely ever returned. The promise made in 1943 remains a ghost, haunting every empty doorway in this silent valley.